I'm going to take you through a full breakdown of exactly what's on this home flight simulator setup. We'll go through every part from avionics to motion and talk about how exactly it all comes together. Now, some of this stuff is quite expensive, so I'm also going to recommend a few of the more budget options that will get you 90% of the way there. So first, let's start off with the FlightSim Pro, which is the Flight Seat Pro and the Flight Stand Pro combined. Now, you can buy this for, I've got my notes here, $1,097 at the moment on Amazon. Now, the reason for buying one of these, I think the first thing would be motion compatibility, which we'll get onto soon. And the other one is the fact that it's fairly adjustable. You can get most of your controls, whether you're on a stick or a yoke, and you can get them in to the right sort of position. And I think finally, mounting your rudders directly to the rudder plate is just super solid. Overall, it's a nice experience. That said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a desk setup. And many people like that, and there's certainly some advantages there. But for this simulator, the one you're looking at, the base, what everything is built around, is the Flight Simulator Pro. So the whole cockpit is sitting on this 17mm form ply. Now, the reason I chose the form ply was, well, the only one was the fact that it was black and it had a matte finish, so I didn't have to paint anything. Now, as far as I'm aware, they use form ply for formwork in the building trade, so you might find some of this stuff at your local hardware store. And then on the underside, there's these little carpet sliders. Now, the reason the whole cockpit sits on this piece of form ply is so I can slide it in and out while the motion, you can see the motion platform there, or maybe not, I'm not so sure, but I can slide it in and out while the motion is still attached. And now for the wooden base that's on top of the actual cockpit. Now, you can't see it right here, so I'm going to stick some overlay in where I've pulled the cockpit out to let you see it. But it's basically 1.2, I'm going to double check that. Here we go. I think, from memory, it's 1.2, yeah. So 1.2 meters wide and 17mm thick ply, which has been painted black. And that's what the yoke is screwed down to. It's what this Avionics sort of panel is screwed down to. And essentially the wooden panel itself is screwed in through the FlightSim Pro sort of deck and secured by a couple of simple bolts. Now we're starting to get into the juicy bit, you could say. So we're talking about the Avionics back panel. So not the Avionics themselves, just this back panel. This is 12mm MDF, and I painted this in a sort of, I think it was like a chalk finish paint, so a dark grey chalk finish paint. I just wanted to avoid all reflections, or as much as I could. Now again, I'm going to show you some footage from the other side of this, and you'll see a couple of large brackets screwed into the back of this and then down onto the wooden board. Then we've got this sort of 2mm compressed type, I say sort of cardboard wood. You know, it's extremely flexible stuff. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but if I can find a link on the internet, I'll link that one up. But that's been cut and then just screwed in to the top of that MDF all the way around and then slightly bent. Now you will see, or you might be able to see there is a slight crack. Now that crack appeared, it was after a week or so, and then that crack started to appear. I've just, you know, I've made the radius a little bit too tight to just simply bend that wood around. Now there's probably many different ways I could have done this to avoid it, but that's the way it's done here. And to finish it off, I just got some of these rubber finishing tape on Amazon, cut it to size, pushed it on, and then it just sits there on the front. And just gives it, every time. All right, that's a little bit frustrating, and we'll get to that in a second. So yeah, we've got this rubber sort of trim, and just gives it a little bit of a nicer finish and kind of completes the overall look in a way. And you just saw the light fall down onto the yoke there. So this is a little sort of bar light that I got on Amazon. I'll put a link to this in the description as well. Although I don't recommend using one of these. The amount of times this thing has just fallen off because it's secured by a couple of magnets up there. And if you don't get it perfectly in line, it just, you know, it becomes a pain in the arse, you know, and you can touch this and it will just fall out. So the link will be there in the description, but I do not recommend buying one of those. I also forgot to mention that this was custom CNC cut. So I designed a template and I just took it to a CNC guy and they made a real neat finish of the cut. And that's for all the holes, for all of the avionics and the overall shape. Now I'll stick the PDF, which is 1:1 size, for using with a CNC machine on the website. So if you're checking the website, if you're interested in that, you can download it and take it to your local CNC guy and get it cut, or even edit the file to suit your own design. Now we're starting to get into a little bit more of the techie side of flight simulation, and we're going to talk about the two FlightSimBuilder G1000 avionics panels. Unfortunately, there is no real budget option for one of these. Certainly not with the tactile feedback that you get, because these are what you might call budget when you compare it to some of the others on the market, which are almost twice the price. If you really wanted to though, you could get a couple of cheap tablets and run Air Manager. That as an option. But here we're running the G1000 FlightSimBuilder units. One thing about having something like this, it's definitely not for everybody, because what comes with it is like a limiting factor. You end up kind of really just flying planes that have a G1000, like the 172, the 182, the Caravan, maybe the Mustang, or even the G58. But there's definitely a limited range of aircraft that this is going to work well with. So you've got to keep that in mind. It does limit what you're going to fly, but at the same time, on the other side of the coin, it does offer a little bit more of an immersive experience if you fly it with the right type of planes. Me, I'm always in a 172 or a Beechcraft, so this kind of works out perfect for me. I think the last time I had checked or certainly the FlightSimBuilder G1000s were about $600 US-ish. And that does come in cheaper than a lot of the others in the market, sometimes up to half the price. And it does work well for the most part. I've certainly never had many issues with it at all. It's very much a central part of the simulator that you're looking at here. And now we're going to move on to the Stream Deck. Now, don't be alarmed about the t-shirt change. It is a new day. This is a slightly longer video than I had anticipated. But the Stream Deck, this is the 32 XL version. Now you can get the 15 key, or you can get the Stream Deck Plus. Now that's the one with the rotational knobs. I've had all of them for the flight simulator, and I've ended up using the 32 XL the most. But certainly the 15 key, still super useful. The same with the Stream Deck Plus. But there is an alternative to the Stream Deck. It's called the AmpliGame. Now, I've never used this. Let's just be clear about that. I have no idea what it's actually like to use, but from the outside, it looks like it has very similar functions. So maybe you'd want to look at that if you want to save a few dollars here and there. Then we have the VirtualFly Switcho radios panel. Now, in this setup, this is a little bit of a double up with the functions that you'll get on the G1000s. But it will give me some basic information about the plane and the configuration. For instance, your flaps and trims, your elevator, your flap stages. I can see here right now it's telling me the pitot heat is on and the parking brake is on. You can see that there. That's me pushing and pulling the parking brake in and out. Same if I go for the flaps. You'll see the flaps indicator moving down or up. But likewise, if this plane had a retractable gear, which it doesn't, but if it did, this landing gear light would come on and off during transition. You also get your nav radios and your comm radios, and you've got an autopilot panel across here, and that's where the kind of double up starts to happen. It's very much a non-essential in this kind of setup, but you do also have a swipe to a separate sort of like kind of little glass cockpit screen here. So I would say if you're trying to build a setup like this, you'd maybe want to leave this out. This is more for if you're running a desk setup. A desk setup, something like this is really beneficial. But again, it's up there in terms of price. I think around the 1,000 euros. I'm not sure how that translates. In fact, let me just double check that. Right, so that's 895 euros. So I think the conversion to US dollars is around the same. So you're talking like 900 bucks. On this type of sim, it's definitely doubling up on some features here. Not essential, but whoops. But great if you've got a desk set up and maybe you don't have a set of G1000s. The next thing to go over is the iPad. This is a iPad M3. And I just use it for loading Flight Planner for Microsoft Flight Simulator. And I don't know if you can see it there, that's all I really use this for on the Flight Simulator anyway, because obviously iPads are pretty functional things. But you know, I've got this bracket here that I got on Amazon. I don't know if you can see that in that sim there, it kind of tilts up and down, side to side. But when I want to fly the sim, I just bring this over, snap it in, and away it goes. It's perfect. You could easily, very easily, if you wanted something just for the sim, just get a real cheap tablet. You could probably pick something up for a couple of $100. Even a really old iPad would do the trick, because this is literally just loading the planner for Flight Simulator via the web, via Chrome, the browser. That's all it is. Now on to the rudders. These are the Thrustmaster TPRs. Now this was a toss-up between the Thrustmaster and the Virtual Fly rudders. And the reason I ended up going with the Thrustmaster rudders for this sim setup was they just felt a little bit more versatile. And of course, these are running the damper mod from CubeSim, and I'll put a link to both of those things in the description as well. So next on the list is the TQ NEO. Now you'll see there's two parts here. There's the lower section and the top section. We're just talking about the throttle quadrant, so this top section here. Now this is one of the most expensive parts in the cockpit, coming in at around 1,700 euros. So it's about as high end as it gets. But just check out my review I did in these last year, and I show you what's actually in the internals and the way they feel. And honestly, these are probably one of the coolest things on the sim, and it's something that you interact with all the time. And these actually come with two different configurations, so you can set them up for like a twin engine turboprop. Right now these are set for a single engine piston, and you can see you got your mixture, your prop RPM, and your power. The trim wheel on the side here belongs to this bottom unit, which we'll talk about in a second, but this is the creme de la creme of throttle quadrants. Now, based on that price, that 1,700 euros, I mean, that might make some people feel a little bit sick in the mouth, but there's options. There's options that will get you reasonably close in terms of function. Let's talk about the Bravo throttle quadrant by Honeycomb. Now, I know Honeycomb don't have the greatest track record right now, but the Bravo throttle quadrant is has far more of a feature set than this and can do a lot more. You're missing out on the build quality and the actual feel of the throttle. But really, the Bravo throttle quadrant will get you pretty close to what you see for this full sort of section here. So if you don't want to spend the 1,700 euros, check out the Honeycomb Bravo throttle quadrant. So next we've got the Trims Neo. Now this is what the TQ Neo is connected to. The Trims Neo consists of this trim wheel and all these functions at the bottom. So you've got your parking brake, your gear, your flaps, your rudder trim, your aileron trim. Now this panel again is about 1,700 euros. Really up there in terms of price. But what you're getting is the same build quality as the TQ Neo. Both of them bolt together quite neatly. This trim wheel actually is a working trim wheel, so you can see it adjusting in real time if you're on autopilot. The LED indicators for the likes of the wing flap, it will tell you at what stage you are with your flaps. Same goes with the rudder trim. So these are like visual indicators to tell you exactly where you are. And you've got your transition lights and your parking brake on and off. Now we briefly spoke about the Honeycomb Bravo throttle quadrant, which will do some of these functions. And honestly, the value of that Honeycomb throttle quadrant, you know, it's going to replace all of this, but it's just doesn't have the same build quality. It does not have the same feel. It's not even close. However, it does have around the same, you could say the same amount of function, give or take a few of the options that you get as what this kind of whole piece is delivering. So if you were looking to build something like this and you want to save a large chunk of money, you would forget about this and go to the Bravo throttle quadrant. But if you want the absolute best for that kind of GA style flying, both your piston and your turboprops and your twin engines, then this is it. It's time to talk about the Brunner Mark II force feedback yoke. Now this thing you could say is the star of this cockpit. But again, like some of the other stuff, it's pretty expensive now. It comes in at I think just under $2,200. It's basically going to read some telemetric data from the sim, and it will simulate the airflow over the wing and the control surfaces. So, and it will also do things like engine vibrations, turbulence, just the lot. The software, the UI experience in the software isn't great. It's a bit difficult to understand. However, the software itself and what it actually produces when you get it right is phenomenal. This is the best force feedback yoke I've used yet. Now, it does have a baby brother, the NG, which I think, I can't remember, don't quote me on this, but I think it's around $1,100. So a fair chunk cheaper than this, but certainly less powerful. And it doesn't have as much of a throw. I think this is running about 160 centimeters of full throw, which is really nice. But if you wanted to go cheaper than that, you'd be looking at the Moza force feedback yoke. In terms of what you're missing out on, I think it's the feel that the software is delivering, because the build quality, I would say, is mostly comparable. Some areas the Moza's got the upper hand, and some areas the Brunner has the upper hand, but you know, they're comparable. But where they differ is the actual feel you get out of the sim. And that's for X-Plane and Microsoft Flight Simulator. And in fact, X-Plane, the feeling is actually amplified and the difference is even greater. But certainly the Moza is a good option if you want to do it in a budget. There's also a company called FlightSim.com. Now that's flight with an E. I'll put a link in to the video with that. Now, I haven't tried any of the products, but I do believe they're kind of bouncing around that same sort of budget force feedback sort of area that Moza are in. Now, do you need force feedback for sort of an immersive experience like this? You know, it does add a lot to the sim, but there are Options, and I've mentioned honeycomb a few times and I'm going to mention them again. They have I think it's the Alpha. It's a superb little yoke. It only has about 90 centimeters of pitch, but it's got that full 90 degrees that you'd be looking for on the roll. It's a superb little yoke and definitely something that you could use to build a setup like this. For monitor stands, what you can see behind me here is two Next Level Racing Elite monitor stands. Now the reason I had to go with two Elite single monitor stands was because before I had these 48-inch OLEDs, I had triple 55-inch TVs, and the triple Elite monitor stand isn't compatible. So basically what I did was I bought two single Elite monitor stands and then put a large or a long cross beam in the middle. I managed to make some workarounds using some other extra pieces of extrusion that I've got lying around from other cockpits and some racing simulator cockpits that I've had over the years. And from all that, I was able to mount those triple 55-inch TVs. I think the same problem still exists with the 48-inch OLEDs, so I'm not sure if the triple monitor stand would actually fit. You'd have to do some measurements there. Then I've got some pieces left over for a little bit of a project going forward, just to flesh this out a little bit more. Now for the triple LG 48-inch gaming OLED displays. Now initially I started on a 55-inch triple setup and I was worried about coming down in size to 48, but the benefit of coming from TVs to actual displays has been well worth it. Do I miss the 55-inch sort of scale and size? Absolutely. Is it worth the trade-off for the 48-inch? For all the benefits that you get? And I'm talking about like a wider variable refresh rate range, straight to DisplayPort. There's no HDMI converters because they used to be a bit of a headache. And then obviously the fact that they're OLED, the deep blacks are absolutely insane. One of the things, and it seems so minor, that every time you go to switch the sim on with the televisions, I would have to walk around and switch each one on individually before the PC gets turned on, just to make sure everything runs nice and smooth. And even then, sometimes one TV wouldn't pick up the signal and I'd have to do a restart. And then as if by magic, you know, it's working again. Going straight to DisplayPort to the PC, and these being actual monitors, you know, I'm turning the PC on and everything just comes on. It has not skipped a beat once since I installed them. So there's a lot less frustration there. Some of the things I hoped I was going to get moving to OLED from the 55-inch TVs was less heat. That hasn't been the case. There's still a little bit of heat pumping off the face of the television and the back, so that's about the same. But the thing about these that completely trumps the televisions is the matte coating on the front. Televisions were pretty glossy, even to the point where they would reflect against each other in the corners. Now, that problem's completely gone with these LG OLEDs. A really nice matte surface, no reflections, no glare. It's just a beautiful display to run a flight simulator on. The only problem is I don't think you can get these anymore. I don't know whether they've stopped making them, but certainly I haven't seen them around or in stock. Now, ASUS do make a 48-inch OLED version of this. I think they're a bit more expensive. These were more like, well, in fact, I got these as factory seconds and I think I paid about 1,500 Australian dollars for these, which is about 1,000 US dollars. But yeah, it's just a bit unfortunate that these have become quite hard to get. Now, if you do want to scale it back, you want to look for a cheaper option. Definitely 55-inch TVs, 43-inch TVs. Just try and get something with a variable refresh rate. Now, you could go down further below 43-inch TVs and go with a 32-inch monitor. So you'll get all the benefits of the monitor. You'll also have to drive less pixels. So your PC is going to have a much, much easier time running Microsoft Flight Simulator. I would say for that kind of immersion factor, the sense of scale, it really comes into its own around that 55-inch sort of size. You still get it at 43, 42, 43 inches and up, but once you get to 65 and bigger, it starts to feel a little bit too big. So the sweet spot for me is between that 48 to 60 inches. That's the sweet spot for getting that kind of real world feeling scale. Now, one of the most interesting things is this motion platform here. Now you can see it's bolted directly to the FlightSim Pro on the inside, so it's pretty compact. Now, what it does essentially is there's a rocker on the front of the cockpit. So the front of the cockpit is basically stationary, and the motion platform sits in the back. So the cockpit will pivot from the front. Now you can have this on the front or the back. I prefer having it on the back and pivoting from the front because obviously we've got the screens there. And that keeps a fairly anchored point against the screens because, just to be clear, the screens do not move. The only thing that moves is the entire cockpit. Now I like to run my motion platform in a fairly subtle state. I like to keep the movements at a minimum. I think if you overdo it, it can become fairly distracting. But I'll throw some footage on the screen. I might even bounce the aircraft down the tarmac, let you see what that looks like. I'll take it up into the air and we'll give you a bit of a split view and you can see how it reacts with how I'm flying. So what do you get with the motion platform? You get your pitch, your roll, and heave, which is up and down. All the effects are fairly minimal when you look at them, but it's how it feels that makes a big difference. Things like turbulence, the pitch of the plane, the bank of the plane, not so much. I like to keep that, like I said, pretty low. Landing, ground effects. Look, there's a lot you can actually do and configure your own profiles. Now, like a lot of the other stuff on the cockpit, the motion platform, again, it's a pretty expensive one, coming in at about 3,000 US dollars. Do you actually need one to build a setup like this? Absolutely not. It's just a real nice to have. But what many people say, and I'm the exact same, once you try it or once you have it, you'll never want to go back. Now, as far as budget options for motion, I don't have much experience with motion platforms. The Next Level Racing one is the only one I've ever tried, so I really can't speak on that. Now, something I get asked quite a lot is, how do you get rid of the bezels on the monitors? So this is the ASUS Bezel-Free kit, which you can get on Amazon. The only problem I have is with the 48-inch monitor because it's too big for the traditional size of the ASUS Bezel-Free kit. So I had to buy 2 of those. Now, I'm not going to fully explain how I mounted this because I did another video about that. I'll leave a link to that video in the description and maybe you can just skip through to the Bezel-Free kit section. For the software, I'm always going to be running either Microsoft Flight Simulator or X-Plane. And what you can see here, we're sitting in the 172 in X-Plane. Of recent, I've been much more into Microsoft Flight Simulator, and there's one reason for that, and it's simply the performance. I can't get the performance out of X-Plane that I can get in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Now, in terms of a simulator like this one, X-Plane does have some huge advantages, and it's mainly to do with the force feedback controls and the motion platform. Both of those things with X-Plane are absolutely mind-blowing. The feel you get through the Yoke, Flight Simulator just can't compete with X-Plane in that regard. Then you go back to Microsoft Flight Simulator, you know, I'm just getting, the graphics are miles ahead of what X-Plane is, but the flight modeling is not. So you don't get quite as much out of the Yoke and the motion platform with Flight Simulator as you do with X-Plane. So me, I'm always bouncing between both of them, but I find myself 70% of the time in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and I'm hoping the 2024 edition is only just going to keep getting better over the next 2 to 3 months. Now, all this talk about performance, we've got to talk about what type of PC or what we're running to get a triple 4K setup running smoothly. So I've got a custom built PC and it's running a 4090 graphics card, a 7800X3D with 64 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM. And that's the basics behind it. And what I tend to get, depending on which update or which version of Flight Simulator you're looking at, anywhere between 40 and 60, 65 frames a second using DLSS, of course. And DLSS these days is really quite incredible. But one thing I would say is I don't tend to fly in the sim over densely populated areas. You know, I'm always out in the backcountry flying around. So that again in itself probably makes it a bit easier for the PC to run. Now, talking X-Plane, I did mention the performance issues. You know, sometimes I'm sitting below 30 frames a second in X-Plane with the triple 4K setup. And it kind of blows my mind in a way because the rendering of the graphics, you know, let's be honest, it's pretty shit in X-Plane. And you would think that it would be much lighter on the graphics card, but it's not. Keeping that in mind, Microsoft, I don't know what they're doing, but it's almost magical compared to what you get in X-Plane, and that goes along with the performance as well. So if you've made it this far in the video, chances are you're up for building something like this. So I've got a few tips and a few things that you should definitely think about before you start. I'll just grab my iPad as I've got a few notes here, I don't want to miss anything. So the first thing I want to talk about is the heat from the screens. Every set of screens that I've had, there's been some heat emitting into the cockpit. So that's something you definitely have to think about. And I would say, if you can, get to a store and just put your hand up against the front of the screen. Give you a gauge of how much heat's actually emitting out. The next thing would be avoid using cables, HDMI cables, longer than 5 meters, as you will get a little bit of signal degradation. Now, I actually don't know if that's still the case these days, but it certainly used to be that. Following on from HDMI cables, if you're using televisions, you know, you're going to have to use DisplayPort to HDMI converters. Now, these can, from time to time, just not work, like I explained earlier in the video, and that's something you just have to put up with. Now, I will leave a link in the description for the ones I used to use, but just keep in mind that if you are going to go down the television route, you will more than likely experience some screen flicker. Sometimes a screen won't turn on. Sometimes you need to restart the computer for it all to work. At least that's my experience. Now, when you're planning a build like this, I always say start with the screens first and then work back, because the resolution of the screens that you choose will dictate how much you need to spend on your PC, more importantly, your graphics card. This system here is a 4090 running triple 4K using DLSS, and it barely scrapes by at a level I would say was acceptable, being that 40 to 60 FPS range. Now, when it comes to the size of the monitors, I would say over 55 inch, it's kind of pointless. It starts to get too big. I think the sweet spot is 55 inches. These are 48, but you can even go as low as 43 inches to get that sense of scale and effect. Next thing would be to avoid using USB extension cables if possible. I just find that sometimes when you use these, I get USBs dropping in and out. If I can just have one USB hub and then one single cable running to the PC, perfect.